Could you go and talk with him and just see, because I know he encountered some issue database-wise, and I don't know if it's something that your knowledge might be helpful for, but if you could go interface with him, that would be great. Thanks a ton. Okay, thank you very much, Mohammed. Okay, so much of our work on the analysis front is involved in classifying the underlying state of participants, and indeed of healthcare context sometimes, using classification tools. This is certainly not all we do. We work at multiple levels of that stack, many levels, in fact, with biostatistical tools, dynamic modeling, machine learning methods, beyond classification, but state classification is one of the big ones. And we work at this level for several reasons. Trying to classify, for example, is a person smoking right now? Are they using an e-cigarette or neither? Are they likely to be eating right now? Are they likely in a vehicle or not? Is the phone even on their person or not? These are germane questions for several reasons. One reason that I should have here, but for some reason is absent, is some of that information is critical for basic quality assurance on that data. I mean, for a lot of our analyses, we forgive the presumptuous nature of my edits, but I figure it better to have it than not at all. So with quality assurance, surely for most of our data, we want to confine our analysis to periods where the data from the phone is representative of the person's state. After all, we may be recording data about the accelerometry and gyroscope and position of the phone. But if we don't have some assurance that the phone is with someone right now, then that offers limited insight into their health behavior. Their phone may be sitting at home and they're out for a morning jog, and we have no understanding of that from the phone data, and we may be fooling ourselves if we're thinking the phone data is an adequate representation of their own situation right now. So often we will want to filter the data that we are collecting so that we're confined our analysis to those times where it's on person. And to do that, we need a classification of sorts. Is the phone on the person or not at this moment? In other cases, this information is germane because we want to develop some sort of hypotheses concerning behaviors of interest. I noted in my opening talk the fact that there's a lot of types of health-related information on key behaviors involving dietary intake, what you're eating, involving physical activity, information involving your contacts. Whoa, I'm trying to turn this thing on, but it's exhibiting truculence. Information regarding your location, movement, that's very important for understanding health behavior, but which is poorly measured through traditional techniques in many cases, not all, but many. Or those techniques are very burdensome, like direct diaring. And secondly, that sort of information is underrepresented in the literature, really reliable information, the micro behavior at those levels. And if we're to develop hypotheses concerning, dynamic hypotheses concerning micro behaviors involving alcohol seeking or involving mental health and distress based on stressors and based on response to intervention measures, or if we're trying to understand microbehaviors associated with quitting and staying quit, preventing relapse, or the ways in which e-cigarette use interacts with cigarette use, to really develop hypotheses about those conditions, we need to know something about those behaviors over time. When a person is smoking, when a person is eating, or when a person is engaged in e-cigarette use, or when a person is likely to be engaged in active physical transport versus being in a vehicle, where both may give comparable levels of accelerometry readings and for certain measures. And if we look at the classifications, we may be able to understand their underlying state in a way that builds our dynamic hypotheses. If we can classify their situation at different times. During this time, they're in a vehicle. During this time, they're smoking. This time, they're eating. This time, they're engaged in active transport versus this time, they're in a vehicle. Second of all, we can use this sort of information to create models of behavior that are of significance. So we may be able to, for example, use it on the basis of some sort of Markov model of transition between different behaviors. We might perform some sort of statistical analysis using something like structural equation modeling or path analysis methods, where we are estimating parameters from the data, but estimation of those parameters depends on us positing certain behavior at certain times. So we need to know something about the underlying behaviors to estimate these parameters. And one area in which for which those parameters might be estimated is dynamic modeling. It's these models that address policy questions, that address counterfactuals, that allow us to understand, examine out for longer periods of time what are the consequences of these behaviors we see in terms of health outcomes. So here, some of the data from these state classifications ends up informing a dynamic model. So we do classifications related to contact patterns. So we feed that data into a model. Or we do classifications regarding cigarette use and e-cigarette use, and use it to build a dynamic model that posits certain interactions between those behaviors. Or we do so with physical activity and eating as picked up on the devices. So in short, classifying underlying state is a recurrent theme in our work and is a prerequisite for certain types of analysis and can help improve the quality of data on issues as basic as filtering out irrelevant data where the phone is not even being carried by the person. Now, in order to do these classifications, we can draw on many types of information. Remember the 4 V's. Volume, yes, but remember also velocity. We have high velocity data coming in. It's fine temporal resolution. We have variety, a bunch of different types of sensors, particularly once you start thinking about including questionnaire results and smartwatches, etc. And then finally, veracity. And here, if we're to think about classifying something like smoking or not, we can actually get a fair degree of insight from a number of measures. One is even just looking at the types of behavior with which they're associated, the types of behavior that might be classified by Google activity or that might be classified by other classifiers that we've worked on and contributed. We can look at things like the likelihood that a person is smoking in 2 different cases based on their behavior. So here we see the profile associated with smoking involves a preponderance of standing compared to cases where they're not smoking. So there's some association, in short, between certain types of behaviors on the one hand and the likelihood of smoking on the other, the 1 and 0 at the top there. That's data actually collected by tools within the IEPI project. In other cases, we might look at differences in distribution and histograms according to different physical measures. So this would be, for example, using an indicator of Wi-Fi signal strength, or an indication of GPS accuracy, for example, or speed on the part of an individual. We might be able to tease out sort of different patterns where in one case the orange is cases of smoking versus the distribution associated with where they're not smoking. So the idea is, could we use data from sensors as kind of a proxy, at least a modestly predictive proxy for the underlying behavior, and then be able to ask questions that would confirm, is someone smoking now or not, for example. Okay, and looking across a bunch of different measures, we might be able to tease out patterns. This is work done by Nargis over a year ago now, but I thought, you know, I'd highlight some features of it. She was looking at these many sensor footprints, as it were, of smoking. The types of sensor data that might be gathered from a person when they're smoking across that wide variety of sensor types that are collected by Ethica, and looking at differentiating elements, cases where certain sensor readings seem highly helpful in classifying different cases. So she was looking at accelerometer data, gyroscope data, etc. And long story short, after dredging through quite a variety of these, she actually was able to find some distinctions that were quite predictive, even when taken in isolation. And the current work is focused on taking the temporal context into account, which will allow for reflecting the fact that while each data point may be very ambiguous, once you total up the data points over time and you reflect on the fact that a person smokes for some significant amount of time, a couple minutes, there may be a way to kind of zero in more reliably on their behavior, taking into account the many types of data, the many data points collected during that time. So when we're dealing with data like this, data that has lots of distinctions captured because of the wide varieties of measurands, the wide varieties of types of data collected, all cross-linked, there's a wide variety of techniques to try to work from that data to classification mechanisms. And you know, some of the techniques that we've used have gone from extremely simple, things like naive Bayes classifiers and an algorithmic technique known as support vector machines, which operate on each data point in isolation. Mind you, that data point having many different measurands, you know, accelerometer and gyroscope and the signal strength from Wi-Fi and the accuracy received from GPS, etc. Going from those, but also including machine learning techniques that are more powerful. Things like hidden Markov models, which allow you to take into account temporal context in conditional random fields, which are a technique from the computational statistics area that are very powerful and generalize hidden Markov models in some ways. Here, there's a variety of techniques you can use, many of them from the broad machine learning area. And these can be classified in a whole bunch of different ways. So some techniques are more algorithmic, like support vector machines. Some techniques are very much computational statistics, typically from a Bayesian sort of perspective with priors and you're computing posteriors in principled ways. And I've included there hidden Markov models, naive Bayes, and conditional random fields. And then there's connectionist techniques based on things like neural network and its kind of latest come around in the form of deep learning that have larger scale network structures, but draw on many connectionist ideas that we saw decades ago. So, time is very short. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but just to give you some idea of what's involved, the naive Bayes classifier would posit there's some states indicated by C, a set of states. And the idea is that you have some measurements. You have some things you're actually measuring at that given time. So you have accelerometer, and you have gyroscope readings, different axes of each, and you have different different measurements associated with the mean signal strength of Wi-Fi right now, or GPS accuracy, or what have you. And you are positing here that the probability of being in a certain state, this is what you want to know, what state you're in. Are you smoking or not? The probability of being smoking, given this data, is proportional to the probability of being in that state times the probability of seeing the data given that state. And this is simply a fallout from what's called Bayes' rule, and it comes out from the rules involving conditional probability distributions and joint distributions, and this is something that falls out of probability theory directly. And what naive Bayes does is it imposes a further assumption, which is an extremely strong assumption, that this probability here can be nicely decomposed in. This probability can be turned into a product of very simple probabilities of observing each of these measurements in isolation given this state C. In other words, these are what are called conditionally independent given the state. That's the kind of assumption here, going from this to this. And what this imposes is a very strong assumption about the nature of this data, which is sometimes false, but sometimes good enough that it will get you by with a decent classifier. Not too commonly in my experience, but it's sometimes good enough for certain types of classification. And we're assuming here there's no temporal dependence between the between successive measurements at a given time C. A support vector machine would involve taking the data and trying to separate it with hyperplanes. And there's a involved theory involved in nonlinear, so these don't have to be strictly straight sort of planes. You can separate the data with nonlinear planes by a certain sort of transformation. But fundamentally, you're trying to divide up the data into neat chunks in a very high-dimensional space, where each dimension of the space is associated with a measurement. Each dimension of a space is associated with a certain thing that's being measured. And so one dimension might be some measure of accelerometry, another some measure of gyroscope, using the different axes available. Another might be based on GPS signal strength or what have you. And you're trying to see if smoking data here and non-smoking cases might have a neat separation as defined in terms of these axes. And as I say, there's a much bigger generalization of this that I can only nod to, which involves the fact that we can articulate nonlinear separation mechanisms, sort of a curved surface that might separate things. But support vector machines allow another way of trying to formulate a principal rule, or some sort of, I should say, effective rule that will separate these sort of areas. Naive Bayes is based on theory. Support vector machine comes out of a very different area and is more computational in nature. And there's some ways that you can take very high-dimensional data and reduce it to smaller dimensions, such as with this t-distributed stochastic network embedding, to try to confine it to a smaller number of dimensions. In other cases, we use hidden Markov models, and these have been some of our workhorses. We have a nice library that's been built up with cross-validation mechanisms and so on that Jen has been working on, and Narges and Iden and Amin at different times. And this involves a situation where we again posit, with hidden Markov models, we again posit a given participant as being in one of a set of hidden states. Back there, we saw those states being called C. That was sort of our set of classification. So maybe this would be a person who's smoking an e-cigarette, they're using they're smoking, they're using an e-cigarette, or they're engaged in neither. That would be 3 states. In the simplest case, this might be on person and off person, which economizes screen real estate here. But in general, this might be 3 states, it might be 10 states, it might be 2 states. And the idea here is that in contrast to naive Bayes or support vector machines, where we're dealing with data from each time point in isolation, here we're dealing with data over time, capturing the temporal context. So in other words, we're reflecting the fact that, okay, if a phone is off person right now, it's unlikely to be, picked up within the next 10th of a second. It's more likely to remain off person for some period of time. And what that means is that the data from the previous time point is actually has some significance, has some implications, or some certain relevance, and certainly some correlation with the data from now. So by looking at the data not just from each time step in isolation, but data from nearby time steps, I might be able to get a more reliable view whether I'm off person. Maybe if we're looking at off person, there's a chance that the phone is bumped, or maybe it's off person in a bus, and the bus is moving around. It's sitting next to you on the seat of a bus, and the bus is moving around. It's kind of jogging and jigging, and it might be mistaken from any one data point that, oh, it's probably being held in someone's hand right now. But once you look at the data from several different time points for the minute or two around it, it starts to become clear this is not a person holding the phone. This is something else going on. It detects signs of motor vehicle use and other ways, the speed of the environment, the nature, the accelerations, and the gyroscope readings might be suggestive of kind of an environment that's vehicular in nature. So there we might use many data points that give greater confidence that we're off person. The way that the hidden Markov model captures that is it posits some underlying states. A given person, if we're dealing with a participant alone, a given person is in one of these states at a time or the other. At a given time, they're in one of these states. And over time, their presence in these states will change. So perhaps on a per minute basis, they have a 20% chance of transitioning from off person to on person. Okay? And given that it's on person, maybe it has a 5% chance per minute of translating to off person. So the idea is, if it's off person, I have a certain 20% chance per minute of picking it up, and if it's on person, I've about a 5% chance per minute of putting it down. And you might argue, well, shortly after you pick it down, you're much more likely to pick it up than later, and you can capture that by dividing these states up a bit. But the general picture is you're in one state at a time, and we posit transitions between them. And to figure out if you're in what state you're in now, you're going to be considering 2 broad things. The first thing that you're going to be considering is the data from this point right now. right now, what are the data saying? What is the measurement saying? Maybe we're trying to figure out, okay, are we off person right now? And we see an acceleration value that's larger. And we say, oh, that might suggest that it's actually being held by someone. It's on person. Maybe it's in their backpack, or it's in their pocket, or it's in their hand, and they're walking around. We'll see a higher acceleration value. But that's not going to be all. Maybe we also consider additional measurements. We consider, okay, what's the orientation of the phone? Kevin talked about this very important data stream. What's the orientation? And maybe we notice this phone is pretty flat. It's laying, you know, it's laying pretty flat there. And we say, okay, you know, that might predispose us to think we're still off person. Okay, yes, there was an acceleration, there was a nudge, but it's still pretty flat. And maybe we find that the phone is plugged in right now. And we say, oh, okay. Yes, the acceleration was higher, but you know, the phone is plugged in. It's leading us to thinking it's still probably off person. But that's not all. That's one set of things we're considering. The real kicker with the HMM compared to, you know, measures that only consider the current time, you know, generalizations in naive Bayes or whatever, we're also considering where did we think, what was the probability of being off person or on person the last time step, the last period of time. So when we considered the 30 seconds before this, what was the probability we associate being off person and on person then? And how likely is it, in short, if we thought in the last time step we're very likely to be off person, what's the chance that we have transitioned from then to this state during that time? And the chance is not terribly high. If we're talking about a 30-second interval and we have a 20% chance per minute, you know, we've got less than 10% chance for that time period of translating. And so we balance these considerations of what we get right now, this data, with what we thought was the case last time, and use that to update our probabilities for this time. Okay, so we take it to our current data, and you know, from the current time point or current time period, and the data from the past one, and we combine them together to get kind of a best consensus estimate of the probability of being in each state now. And on she goes, on she goes. And at some point, that person, we might start to see accelerometer readings that are consistently high. The phone ain't plugged in anymore, and it ain't horizontal, and it will start us to presuppose us to think this is more and more likely. It's more and more likely. It's more and more credible that it's on person. Yes, it's true, the bus could be flipping around. Maybe it's on a gravel road that's, you know, in mud, and maybe someone just happened to unplug it, you know, during that time, and maybe it's just chance acceleration, but it becomes more and more plausible it's on person. So this is kind of roughly how HMMs work, and you're classifying the probability of being in the states, and then having classified that probability from going forward, you can actually use the probabilities, you know, looking into the future. If you're not trying to do it live, not trying to do it online on an ongoing basis, instead you're just trying to look back on the data and say what state were we likely in. You can take into account future data, and it turns out putting those together, you can then try to create overall probabilities you're in each state over time, and come out with a most likely sequence of states that you're in. This person was probably, you know, it was keeping the phone on person till this time, then they put it down for 3 minutes, and then they picked it up for 2, and then they put it down. It was down for the next hour, and then picked up again. Now, this is for on person and off person. Very simple case. But I want to bring home a couple of things. First of all, the types of data we might use to judge this are multifold. It's not just a matter of accelerometry. It could involve gyroscope. It could involve aspects of GPS, like the signal strength. It could involve whether or not it's horizontal, so the orientation, whether or not it's plugged in. All these might be germane for figuring out, is this phone really on person or off person? That's one thing. So it uses multiple types of information. Second, it uses temporal context, the likelihood of transitioning here. And Jim, as late as last night, after you folks were eating dinner and so on, I was working with Jen to try to identify transition matrices for her data that might be best explain the observed data involving vehicular use. So we take into account a temporal context. Thirdly, this general architecture can be used and generalized for many cases. So this needn't be on person, off person. This could be on vehicle, off vehicle. This could be smoking, e-cigarette use, and neither. This could be eating and not, right? This could be sitting, standing, lying down versus active forms of activity. You could have any number of different states here. And without going into it, conditional random fields provide a way of generalizing this to allow for transitions, for example, that are not merely fixed. Transitions that can depend on the measured data and so on, in a way that that helps that helps in classification. So this is some data undertaken by you probably wouldn't like being called a precocious undergraduate, but extremely talented undergraduate, William Vanderkamp, who is working right now for Kevin. And this was work for me before he started that job with look at classification from data. He was operating against some ground truth data that I'll be talking about, trying to classify the behavior of a person according to different poses. Was it off person, sitting, standing, walking? And what you'll see is this is the prediction. This is the HMN's prediction. This is its reference, and you'll see, of about 100, just short of 150, or just over 150,000 measurements. 90, 99, what have you, percent of them were correctly classified as off-person, 90 some odd percent. But you see with sitting, for example, for the cases it was sitting, it got most of them right, but some of them it thought it was off-person. There were some of these sitting cases that it thought was off-person. And we did some further investigation in this and found that there were certain types of ones that were more likely, certain sitting contexts that were more likely to be classified. It made very few confusions between sitting and standing. So for those who are interested for health reasons in distinguishing sitting and standing because of their rather different impacts on health as different in the light of the sedentary behavioral literature, the fact that it made very few confusions of this sort is notable. With standing, most of those, again, it got right, but interestingly, it confused some of them as off-person. That requires some elucidation. And then with walking, it had very little trouble confusing walking with any of these others. It was bang on, for classifying walking states compared to these other types of states. And over time, using a classifier like that, using a hidden Markov model, we can map out for different periods of time. These are little intervals of 30 seconds each. It can map out, okay, what was the likely state of a person there? You notice this is off person, and so red is off person, and green is sitting, blue is standing, this purple color is walking, and then there's some missing data where the phone was just off for long periods of time. One of the very nice things about hidden Markov models is that they can tolerate missing data quite well. And You can have periods where it's simply missing, and I should probably mention that. I'll get to that in just a sec, but let me just point out that what this was doing was, you notice that like this peak here, it thought, okay, this is a peak of walking in the middle of two off-person situations. Here's a case of sitting. Here's another case of sitting, whereas it's flanked by off-person. Here, we had walking, sitting, and then walking, etc. So this is some data over time with one particular measure of accelerometer sort of findings, and this is the classification. This is I think this is the true state, and this is the inferred state based on the HMM. So we had ground truth data on this. I'll tell you how we collected it, and this is the inferred state here, sort of what the HMM thought. Now, what happens if there's missing data? Let me just mention that. What happens if there's missing data is that, remember, there's two things that affect, if we're considering a given time point, there's two things that affect what it thinks the likelihood is of being in a given state. One thing is the observations from that time period, but that's not all. It also takes into account where I was, what were the likelihoods of being in each state in the previous time point. Remember that? So if I'm judging, am I an off person right now? I took into account the measurements from right now, but I also took into account where did I think I was 30 seconds ago? What was the likelihood of being on person or off person? And if there's missing data from a given time point, it just becomes essentially it taking into account the old ones, but it recognizes you can transition. So over time, it's going to become more and more uncertain as to where you are, and eventually it's going to approach a situation where your likelihood of being in this state versus this state is just given by chance according to these transition probabilities. So in this case, the likelihood of being in this state would be 0.2 divided by 0.2 plus 0.25. So that would be about 80% of the time it would think it would give you an 80% probability of being in this state over time, and a 20% if you wrote it out long enough, because it's getting more and more uncertain. The last data I saw about this person was an hour ago, so I'm getting more and more uncertain. If it's only been 2 minutes since you've seen them, and you were sure they were off person before, you might say, well, they're still pretty likely to be off person now, given that they have a 20% chance per minute. It's only been 2 minutes. They're still pretty likely to be in that state, but over time that gets washed out. It gets more and more uncertain and more just approaching, what you would think from these probabilities. And so more and more likely, because you have a 20% chance per minute going here and a 5% there, it becomes more and more likely it'll say, well, probably 80% of the time they're here, so if I had to guess 80%, they'd be there, 20% over here. It becomes more and more unlikely. So it tolerates this missing data. Here's an example of sort of one of the types of data used. This was for a given participant. Here's some data for the different measurements. So for the cases, this is one measurement. This is gyroscope, and it's one particular measure of gyroscope, norm of gyroscope, I think. And this is the magnitude of the norm of gyroscope, and this is the probability density of observing that. And so what you see is, for a standing state, the likelihood is your gyroscope readings are very small. They could be larger. You'll notice some noise up here. There are some rare cases where it's really large if it's off person. Think about it's in a car and it's jiggling around or what have you. Sitting is more energetic, so it tends to involve more gyroscope movement. Standing is yet more. And walking, that's this line here. It's going to go and peak way over here somewhere, probably. So you're likely to be much more active. The gyroscope readings tend to be much larger, okay? This is magnitude of 3D rotational speed. And so this is the sort of data that might be used to deduce the probability distributions here that would factor into the likelihood of being in the, judging the likelihood of being in the state based on this data alone, and then it would take into account the likelihood of being in each of the previous time step. Okay, so how do we judge these models? How do we make sense of them? How do we test them? A lot of what we use is ground truth data. So this is data where we've actually recorded the true situation, and we record sensor data, other things by the phone, and then we test our ability with that other data, with the normal data collected via the phone, to predict the ground truth data. So the idea is we have kind of gold standard data, reference data, and we try to judge how well we predict it using only the sensor data as proxies. Yeah. We'll use the ground truth data to kind of cross-validate classification models. We'll sometimes use it to estimate certain sub-areas of it, to estimate statistical model parameters, and then use the other parts to test it. So we use what's called cross-validation. We take part of it and we build the model from that, and we take the other part and test the model with that. Data that it never used to build the model, we use to test it, to evaluate it. We can also use simulation experiments. Arash right now is engaged in an exercise with simulation experiments. So he's actually using a simulation model in a package called AnyLogic to produce data, which is then, and it's used to then test the types of models that might be built here to operate off of the phone data. The idea being, if in the simulation model we know precisely what's going on and we test the vulnerabilities, the gaps or shortcomings or strengths of the sort of classification mechanisms or inference mechanisms, in his case recurrent events analysis, against this known reference. So this is another example of a known reference. Ground truth data is a known reference, but it may be very complex. So often we'll start with simulated data that we know it's dirt simple and or bog simple, and we'll use that to sort of cross-validate the classification models, and then go on to judging it against ground truth data, which is more sophisticated in its issues. Another technique which we've used is what are called pseudo-residuals, which are a very, very nice statistically based technique that can be used to good effect. So for a lot of our work, we've collected ground truth data, this is a sort of long-term project to collect data about kind of the underlying situation for a lot of points of interest. This includes sort of activity, context, health behaviors. So we've we've run studies which pay participants who are smokers and e-cigarette users to record very carefully every time they use a cigarette, when they start, when they stop, when they start using an e-cigarette, when they start, when they stop, when a participant goes into a car, when they get in it, when they get out of it, when they're outdoors and indoors, record when they're indoor, when they're outdoor, when they change posture, etc. And we could do that for health behaviors. So IDEN, for example, maybe using an interface with participants to get them to record starting and stopping of eating. Already he has some data points that we believe are during eating based on other self-reports from other studies, but we'd like to be able to know the full sort of duration of eating. And using that sort of data, we can then test classifiers. We can build classifiers and test them against other portions of the data. And the idea is the classifiers then serve as inobtrusive proxies. They serve as ways of inferring the underlying state given just the sensor data. So we don't have to bother people, or we only ask them about disambiguating questions or confirmatory questions. And that's the beauty of doing it on a platform like Ethica, that we can ask questions if it is uncertain, or to double check, we can pop up questionnaires, in contrast to what you could do on a watch, for example. So this is an interface that we built with a previous version of Ethica for doing ground truthing. So here, someone could be in one of two states: off person, in which case they just indicate if they're in a motorized vehicle or indoors, put down the phone, and they can put in some context, some comments here. Alternatively, during the time that the phone, they can press this button, "I'm picking up the phone," in which case they're further asked, where's the phone on your body, and what is your current posture and activity beyond the motorized vehicle and indoor question. And then put the phone away. It ignores the first 30 seconds of data and the last 45 seconds, because those might be transition points. And using this sort of data, you start and you stop, then you can get the sort of ground truth data that was kind of presented here. This is kind of the true situation. This is the predicted situation. So ground truth data collection interface. And I'm happy to, and most pleased, and even proud to say that Hao and Lin Peng here have created a version of this for Ethica, just in this very boot camp, which can operate. It's not as customized. It's not as refined in terms of the functionality, but I would argue it's more refined aesthetically, to be sure. And it operates with Ethica and standard questionnaire instruments. In the fullness of time, we'd like a custom interface, but that would be a student project. So that's a bit of a glimpse of classification. I want to highlight from the very earliest slides the key point that when we're talking about classifications matter for a lot of things. And they matter for developing dynamic hypotheses about what's going on, for estimating models of various sorts that involve dynamics, and particularly for dynamic models. And that will be our next discussion, but that will have to wait until after lunch, it looks like. Okay? So a little bit about classification, and to give you some sense of some of the challenges, motivations, pitfalls, and sort of domains of progress in that zone. Okay? Any questions? Okay. Very good. So I think we will repair to lunch, and we'll plan on coming back here. I will give a talk on dynamic modeling, and but before that, Winchill Chen may begin to give a presentation on using Tableau, which is software that's on all these machines, to analyze data collected by Ethica. Okay? So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to joining you for lunch, and I'll walk over there.